In the second video on Unity game dynamics, I talked about how to make a mini game that involved throwing an axe at some targets. In this video, I want to show you how to finish up your game so that you have a start screen as well as a win state at the end that will take you back to the start screen to begin the game again or quit. So to start this, let's look at a start screen. I'm going to demo the start screen that I have here. Now you can see that this start screen has a title, Island of Dr. Moreau, and below it, it's got some buttons that are custom made in Photoshop as text that has a highlight over it, so there's a hover effect with your mouse. And if I click, say, the story one here, it plays a sound and it also shows an image that gives you some backstory on what you're doing here. And if I hit the quit button, it's going to print out down here in the command line that this part works. So when you're inside the editor like this, that quit button won't do anything. So you just run a debug line to show that it is running. But when you build the game, it will actually quit the application. And then I have a play button which will take me into my scene. I also want you to notice that this entire scene has a different camera view, and everything's working in here, all of the different particle effects and animation that's moving around for the targets in the water, as well as the power-ups. All of those are actually working, as well as the lighting. So this scene is actually a separate level, and if I hit play, it plays a sound and takes us into the game itself. So we want to look at how to create custom buttons like this and a logo or title for your game, and create a view of your game that will be different than your FPS controller view when you're inside of the main level. So this is actually saved as a separate level. This is actually a start screen level that I have inside of my scenes. So if I go to my scenes folder, I'll find that there is a scene there that I've named Start Screen. And so to create this, you're going to be in your main scene. So let's go over to my main game scene, or my main game level. I named it main game level. And I'll go ahead and double click that. Let's save what we were doing. And you can see that this is the part of the game that I've demoed in the last class. So I want to go in and create a new scene from this scene. And to do that, you're going to want to create a new camera. So in my create menu, I do have a camera, and if I create a new camera, it's going to create it wherever I'm sort of looking, or wherever my 3D scene is focused on. In this case, it created it right in front of the door of my structure here. So I can move this anywhere I want, and it is taking the place of my FPS controller camera at this point. But if I were to play the game, let's say I move this over here so it's clearly in a different position than my FPS controller camera. If I hit play on the game, you'll see that I go back to my FPS controller camera. So I don't want that. I want to be using this new camera that I've set up. So to make sure that the FPS controller camera is not going to be coming up, and also you don't, even if the other camera was taking control, or was, you set it so that it's going to be showing, someone could still hit the keyboard on the arrow buttons or something like that to make the FPS controller move, and you would hear the footsteps even though you couldn't see out of the FPS controller camera. So you don't want that if you're making this new start screen level. So I'm going to want to take that FPS controller and turn it off. So I'm going to go to the little checkbox that is right before the name of the FPS controller in the inspector. So right next to the name of FPS controller, there's a little checkbox. If I turn that off, then it's going to completely not just hide that FPS controller, but completely disable it, remove it from the hierarchy. It's still in the hierarchy, so I could bring it back, but it's not activated at all. I've deactivated it. So once it's deactivated, you're not going to have that camera coming in anymore, and you're not going to be able to move the FPS controller anymore. And so you can see that now we have this camera view of the camera itself. So let me go find that camera. And you can name that camera anything you want, or you could just leave it named camera. It's up to you. I'm just going to leave it named camera. And I'm going to move it somewhere where I think it looks good for my scene. So if I want to see a lot of my scene, maybe I'll move it back, and I'll move it over here a little bit. Maybe I want to be up in the trees and looking downwards a little bit. So if I pull this up in the trees a little bit, then I can go and rotate that downwards and sort of find a good view for my scene. Now maybe we'll take it this way a little bit, or the other way. And then I might want to change the field of view. So if I pull this field of view out, I'm going to see a lot more of my scene. And I don't want to see too much. So I have to be careful about what I'm doing there. If I go too far out, it might be too much. It might be kind of nice to have some framing happening from one of the trees or a couple of the trees. And you can just move it around and see if you can get a view where you're seeing a certain amount of your scene. And then try it out. Hit play and see what that view looks like. Because you're going to see tree movement, you're going to see water movement, and all that's going to be in the frame. And you want to try to find a place where you think you could put a title or logo, maybe up here in the empty area of the sky. You could put it over this tree. And then you're going to want a place for your buttons. You could put them across the bottom here. You could stack them vertically as I did. Maybe right in this area over next to my mini game. So try to figure out a good view that will show something that of your game world that your FPS controller doesn't necessarily show as soon as you go into your game. That'll kind of give a preview to the player of what's going to be inside the game. But don't zoom out so far that you can't tell what anything is. So once you have a camera view there, when you get rid of your FPS controller, I want you to notice something. When you hit play, you might get some error messages. And so I see that I'm getting some error messages here. I'm getting a null reference exception from my portal script. And some of these errors don't really matter. The invalid editor window errors are a bug in this version of Unity. We're using 2019.211, and it's got this editor window bug that was fixed in other versions. So I'm going to ignore those. But the null reference exceptions, whenever you see null reference exception, it means it can't find something that you're trying to reference in one of your scripts. And I can see that it's mainly the portal script and also the platform ride script is coming up here. So those two scripts are causing error messages. So if I want to make sure that those don't affect my start screen, I can go and disable those scripts. Or I could try disabling those scripts to deal with that error message. So if, for instance, I go and open up my portals and select one of the portals, if it's the portal script that's given me an error message, I can just turn it off. And if I select each of these portal scripts and turn, or portal objects and turn their scripts off, then if I go and run it again, and if I open up to see my errors, I see that those portal errors went away, and now I just have the platform ride error. I have the other three errors for the editor window that I'm ignoring, but so turning off those scripts did work. It didn't cause any more errors, and that's because those scripts are looking for the FPS controller because it was plugged into those scripts in order to find it and transform it or translate it to wherever the portal is going. So so that's why it's doing that. And the other script, the platform script, which is in my mini game, that's actually doing something with the FPS controller also. It's parenting it. So in that case, it's also plugged into that script. So that script's actually not on the platform objects. It's on the platform ride object, and I can just turn that off. And it may not be plugged in as a, like in this script, it's actually the FPS controller is not plugged in the sense that there's a public variable and it's dragged in there. Instead, it's doing a find command inside of it looking for the FPS controller. So if we turn that off and check it again, we should see that those errors went away, and now I just have the editor layout errors. So you're going to want to do that, and then you're going to want to save this into your scenes folder. Do a file, save as, and choose your scenes folder wherever you're saving your scenes, and give it a name, and I called mine Start Screen. So we could do a Start Screen 2 if we wanted to here. I'm just going to cancel that because I already have a Start Screen. So I'm going to go back to that Start Screen file now and open it up. And I'm not going to save the stuff that I've done in my main game level. Okay, so now I'm back into my Start Screen. And here's my camera that I created. You can see it's placed in the trees here. And I want to go in and place my title in there as well as my buttons. And those are going to come up inside of Canvas. So here's all my Canvas objects in my hierarchy. And you can see I've got some play buttons in there. I've got a play button, a story button, and a quit button. And these are UI objects. And each of them is going to have a menu buttons script on it. So if we look at that script, and that script is available in the Canvas course, this is the menu button script, and we're going to go through and look at it. It's going to go on each one of these buttons that we're going to create here. And also we need a title or some kind of logo for the game, where you choose a good name that will have something to do with your game. I chose the Island of Dr. Moreau and created just some text inside of Photoshop for that. Here is my title. And so to create this text inside of Photoshop, I needed to make sure that it would come up transparent so that I would see the background around it. I'm putting a glow on it and an outline as well using layer styles. And then I did a similar thing with the buttons in here. So let's take a look at how I created the text here. So to create a logo, you're going to choose some kind of size for your logo. So you're going to do a File, New. And I think I just did something. You think about how big your screen is. My screen is HD sized for the default size of my game. So that's 1920 by 1080. So I thought that if it's approximately 2,000 wide and 1,000 tall, 1,000 by 1,000 is going to be plenty big enough for my title. And of course, I'm going to use 72 resolution because we don't need any higher than that for screen-based images, and I've got it set to just white. That's going to create a white square, and to make the title, I just decided to do text. So you could do text, imagery, you could make a nice logo, whatever you want to do. But I just typed in some text. And so I chose to do Island of Dr. Moreau. And you can see that it comes out pretty small. And when you're working with text, you do have a text editor here over near your layers. Your text comes up in a layer. It is a text object, so it's resolution independent. It's made of curves. And you want to choose some kind of good font for your text. So you could do that up here on the top menu bar. You can set your colors and everything. But it's a little bit easier to work with if you use this text tool. It's a character tool that is an A with a line next to it. If you open that up, you have a lot of different interactive options for working with the text in Photoshop. And so I'm going to choose a size in here. And if you have it at the largest size, then I would want to do an edit free transform on this and just scale it up a little bit. Now, I may not want to make it the full 1000 by 1000 because I probably have to scale it down in that case, but I might want to try to make it a little bit, fill up the frame. And you can see when I move it around that it's telling me where the center of this is. And then I'm going to crop it once I sort of get it the size that I want. And then, so get it the size that you want and hit any tool over in the toolbar or click on the checkbox in the upper menu and it will set it into place. So at this point, I want to make sure that I have the right color. I mean, maybe I want a little bit of brighter red than that. I decided to go with a text. You want to choose some kind of font and the color and everything. It's going to match the aesthetics of your scene. So in my scene, I have very much of a sort of dark, fully saturated colored aesthetics, and it's at night and it's got some strong colors, and there's going to be some creatures that are going to follow me on this level, and you're throwing hatchets and stuff, and if you die there's a splash screen that comes up that looks like blood splatters. So I wanted to keep with that theme in the menu, and so I decided to go with red and a text or font that is kind of blood-like, so that like you're writing the text in some blood or something like that. So again, this is kind of it's going towards a little bit of a survival horror type of aesthetic, so that's appropriate for this. So in this case, I chose this chiller font, and when you bring up your text and you open up this character editor, if you open it up if you click on the drop down arrow next to where it says the font, then you can go in and just go through and interactively see what all your different fonts look like. So I could have chosen this font if I wanted a different aesthetic, a more formal aesthetic. I could have chosen this font if I wanted a Pirates of the Caribbean type of aesthetic. So all of these different fonts have a different feel to it. Some of them might have a more literary feel. Some of them might have a handwritten feel. So, try to use your knowledge of design to come up with a text which you feel is appropriate for the aesthetics of your game that you're building. Something like this one right here would not be, it's called Curls MT. It would not be appropriate for my game because it's very whimsical and almost like a Dr. Seuss type of font, and so that would be for some more light, um, really happy type of game. Mine doesn't really have that feel to it, that kind of aesthetic. So I chose Chiller, and kind of went with some of the blood splatters effect that I also wanted to use on the button press for this. So the first thing you're going to do is use some of your tools after you choose your font. Go ahead and kern the font and make it look like it fits together. You can see that these two lines here are really separated, and that usually is not what you want in a logo or a title or something like that. You want these to be closer together. So so you would want to maybe choose your second line here and go to one of the ones here that allows you to move it. And so I could move it up. I'm using this one on the right here, top right, to move it up and sort of fit that M closer into the A and N on the upper line, and the D is getting closer to the island to make that a little bit more tight and fitting together better. Now this line of the M kind of matches the N line because they're closer together. You can see that now. And you could do other things in here. All of these, there's different kerning and stuff to pull these letters closer together. I think they look fine as they are, so I would probably just leave it for now. And you do want to choose a color. And because I know that I knew that I wanted to give it some three-dimensionality, I didn't want to choose too dark of a red. So I want this to really pop out with color. So I'm going to go all the way to the right where my strongest color is. And I'm going to go fairly high up, maybe not all the way up where it's almost neon red, but pretty high up, so I get a good upper mid-tone red there. And I want to be able to have some dark reds, and I want to be able to have some lighter reds too. And one thing that will make that easier is to not have this on white. So I could take my background, which is currently white, and choose more of a mid-tone gray, and drop with the paint bucket tool, drop that gray into that background. And that's going to make it easier for me to see the lighter and darker parts of the logo when I'm working on the actual text. So if I go back into the text here, if I want to give this some dimensions, then I'm going to use things like layer styles. So I'm going to select the layer, and then I'm going to go to a layer style under the layer menu, and I can put things like a stroke. So if I want to pop this out against a background, I might want a dark stroke. You can see this is the green stroke that I was using earlier. I did use that, but initially I chose to do a dark red stroke. So I would just go in and choose something like that. And I used a fairly small dark red stroke. So I didn't want it heavy-handed. I wanted it to be very crisp. And so like maybe just one. And if I look at that, I can see that that's popping the text out from that gray background a little bit more because of that dark red stroke that's going around every letter. And then to give it some dimensionality, I also put some bevel and emboss on it. And so if I go to the bevel and emboss, I used a inner bevel, and that pops out a little bit of the edges. It gives me some lights and darks, and so I might want it the light coming straight down, or I might want it to come from an angle. By moving this, I can place it in different places, which will give different effects. I liked it just straight down, so I left it there. And um, once you have that, you can affect, whether you want a white as your highlight and black as your um, shadow area. You can choose colors there, but the white and black is actually just going to lighten up the amount of the color that is the main color on the text. So it's not going to go all the way to white. Even when I put the opacity all the way up. So you can see that I could pull that down, or I could pull it all the way up. And that's given me a little bit of an effect on there, a little bit of a darkening and lightening. So you have different effects that you can use in here. They're going to sometimes come up automatically. I am just using normal for this. So once you choose those things, you can then affect how much depth you're going to have on that. You can see if I go higher on the depth, the lights and darks become more pronounced. So it's up to you whether you want to do that. I just use a little bit to sort of just give me some highlights. And then you can set your size, whether you want a lot or very little. And you can soften it or make it more hard-edged. And I used a little bit of soften there too, because it's blood. It's supposed to be smooth. So that adds a little bit of the highlighting. And if I say okay to that, there's also drop shadows and stuff that I could use, but it's not really appropriate if I'm going to put this up on the sky. I don't want to drop shadow onto my sky. That would look weird. If it was on the ground, or if it was on some kind of wall or something, drop shadow might look good. And then I decided to also go in and use some filters. So I went to the filter gallery and okay, so it's telling me that if I want to use the filter gallery, I need to convert this text from curves. So at some point, you may want to add an effect or a filter that requires pixels. And right now, this doesn't have any pixels. It's got text, which is vector curves, and then it's got some effects, which are mathematically generated. So all of this that I'm looking at here is mathematically calculated. It's not pixels. So it's very clean. It's resolution independent. I could scale it any way I want, and it would never get blurry or get any ragged edges on it. But if I want to do certain pixel effects on it, then I need to actually convert this. So to convert it, you're going to rasterize the type. And you can also rasterize the layer style by right-clicking it. And that gives me pixels that I can actually then go up here and do a filter gallery and take it in. And I decided I wanted to do a little plastic wrap on it, which creates some additional highlights that makes it look like it has some volume to it, and it's kind of liquidy, um, so that I get that blood effect. So you can adjust your highlight strength in here to be very, very white or a little less so. And so I'm using a little bit in the middle, and you can do however much detail you want. You just move it around and see what that looks and decide what looks good to you. And smoothness, same thing. If you slide it, these are all very interactive sliders. You can see the effect immediately, and just do it based on what looks good to you. And if I turn it off, I can see that it's definitely adding that dimensionality to it that the other one didn't have. So if I say okay to that, now I look like I have that sort of wet effect where it's actually liquid. And I decided to go ahead and put an extra effect on that because when I brought this in as it was, it didn't pop out against the background quite enough for me. It was a little bit hard to read. So I decided to put a very high contrast sort of green around it to create an effect which would be even more in line with the history of the sort of story of Island of Dr. Moreau. So it's kind of like a very old. It's in the public domain at this point because it was written in the 19th century, and it's been in a lot of different media. It's a good transmedia story, but it's been in comic books. It's been in pulp magazines that were kind of like science fiction magazines or horror magazines. So I wanted to get that sort of pop look a little bit from a 1950s horror movie or a pulp fiction magazine type of thing. So that kind of high contrast green I can do also through layer styles. It's just I would put another level of those on. So just going back to layer styles again, after I did all of the other stuff with the filter, then I can put additional layer styles on it, because layer styles don't just work with the text. It works with any pixel-based image too. So if I wanted another stroke to be sort of bright neon green to sort of pop that out, then I could put that around there and maybe even make it a little bigger, make it 2 or 3 pixels to really notice that. And then I also added an outer glow to it that I made green as well, and it transitions off to transparent, and you can adjust your range and your opacity and your size for that. And so that gives me that sort of green neon type of glow, and because it's a complementary color to the red, it really makes the red pop out too. So once you have something like that and you like it, you can send it over to the Unity file that you're working in. And so I wouldn't want this much space around this logo. I want to crop it fairly close to the logo itself, make sure that I get in all the glow and everything. But I would want to do an image crop on that. Make sure that I don't have the background here. So I'll turn that off. And then I can save that out as a ping file. And you can right click this background and delete it. But usually actually Photoshop's pretty good about just ignoring something that you have hidden now. So if I just save that, do a save as, and choose PNG as my file format, which has an alpha channel, and so it's going to recognize all of that surrounding area, then when I give it some kind of a name, title logo or something like that, and save it into my textures folder inside of my Unity scene, then it's going to have that transparency built into it that I can then use in the game. So I am going to use the smallest file size. Takes a little longer to save, but it doesn't really matter. And then when you go into the game itself, it's going to import it automatically. I go to My Textures and I look for it. That particular one I called Title Logo. And you can see it looks different than the other ones that I've created. The other ones, they have gray around them. They look like they're actually transparent. This one doesn't, and that's because you have to go in and select the object and set its texture type to be one of the types that you're going to use. So if I'm doing just a logo or a title, I want to use Editor GUI and Legacy GUI like we have done before, because that's the one that is just for a image on your GUI screen, your heads-up display. So we are also going to be using on the buttons a sprite 2D and UI. But because that's what the button is looking for. But for the one we're going to do for just the title, use Editor GUI and Legacy GUI, and make sure you set your max size to whatever size you use. So I made 1,000 by 1,000 image, and then I cropped it down, so I know it's less than 1,024. So I'm going to just make my max size 1,024 and apply it. And you can see it's using alpha as the transparency. So the alpha channel that's in there that came in from the PNG file from Photoshop is being used with this. It is giving me a warning about the width and height, but I haven't found that to be any problem, so I'm just going to ignore that warning. And then you have the logo that you can then bring in on a GUI object. So to make a GUI object, we've done that before. If I'm doing the title, I'm going to go to UI and I'm going to do a raw image, because raw images are what we use to create just a static image on the HUD. And if I go to the top of the rectilinear transform component of that GUI object, I do want to reset it, because that will pop it into the middle of my screen where I can see it. 0, 0, 0 in XYZ transform is right in the middle of your screen. So I always reset it in order to make sure that I can see it and I know it's there. Otherwise, it's hard to find sometimes. And then you would want to plug in your texture that you made, your GUI texture, where it says raw image texture, none. and I'm going to drag it over and just drop it where it says none texture. And I can see it coming up in the middle of my screen in my game view, but it's really small. So as soon as you drag that in there, make sure you click the Set Native Size button. That will set it to the size you made it inside of Photoshop. And you can see that it's a little different than the one that I made previously. The colors are a little brighter, and are popping out a little bit more, but maybe they don't fit with my buttons because I made all of these other ones kind of at the same time, so I use the same red for all of them. So if I was going to use this new one here, I'd need to go move it up into the corner here and see what it looks like with my buttons, and maybe it's just too bright at this point. I don't really want to remake my buttons, and maybe too bright is not really fitting the sort of dark aesthetic of my game environment. So, but I could try it out. I would want to move it to the right and up. So if I look at 0, 0, 0 is in the center of my world, then positive numbers are going to take it to the right. Negative numbers are going to take it to the left in X. So if I want to move it to the right, I'm going to put some kind of positive number. And so I would usually try like 200 and see how far it moves. And then if it's not far enough, I'll put a bigger number. So let's try 500. That pretty much moves it exactly where I have the other one. And if I want to move it up, positive numbers are going to go up, negative numbers are going to go down. So if I want to move it up, I'm going to put maybe 200, and then it moves up a certain amount. So it looks like maybe a little bit further. Let's try 300. And 300 puts it pretty much almost right on top of the other logo that I had. So if I want to see this logo without the other one there, I can just go find my other title and just turn it off with the little checkbox next to the actual name of it. And if I hit play, I can then look at it and see whether that looks better or worse than the one that I previously had. It is definitely a little bit lighter in the red than the buttons. The green is pretty close to the same color green, maybe a little lighter on the green too. So probably I would go back to the other one because it's just a little closer to what the buttons are. So I'll turn that back on again, and we can take this one that I just did and go ahead and delete it. Okay, so that's how I created that logo, and you can do yours any way you want. You can place it anywhere you want. Just try to design it so that it's going to look good. And then I needed to also add my buttons. And I decided to add my buttons with sort of stacked vertically underneath the middle of my logo. It had a pretty good space over here for that. And also because when I click my story one, I wanted to have this text come up to tell me a little bit about the story. And so I didn't want it to come up over top of these buttons, so I placed them kind of on the rule of thirds line on the right side of the screen. And that also allows, when you come in, you can see the some of the main things in my game. On the left side of the screen, you can see the outpost structure, you can see the portals with their particle effects, and you can see a couple of the power-up objects that we're going to gather. And you also have the puddle over there with the water that moving, so that's got some reflections on it from the light, so it's showing up quite a bit. And also there's some visual interest over on the right here where the sharks are and the mini game targets are floating in the water. So that's kind of drawing your eye over there as well in the background. And then we're kind of framing the whole thing with this tree on the right-hand side here. So those are some of the design choices I made. You'll have to decide what looks good to you and try to use things like lower thirds or rule of thirds. Might be lower thirds or it might be a right or left thirds, and or across the top, upper thirds, and framing and all the other things that you might put in there. Now for these buttons, I wanted to have a just the standard text for the regular button, the overlay or the hover effect is the green of that's on the logo up here, so that really tells me that that one is being active underneath the cursor. And then I wanted a press effect, so if I press, say, the quit one here, you can see that it goes to that blood splatter effect. And, you know, they all have that sort of blood splatter effect that comes up. And then if I hit play, it's going to go into the game, which I did before. So let's just close that and go back out of that. So those buttons I made exactly the same way in Photoshop. I just did 3 of them for each button, for each of the effects that I wanted to do. And so if I look at that, if I go to the buttons one, here's the play button, for instance. That's just text. And if I wanted to make a quit button or something, I could just type it in. And I did duplicate the layers in order to make them all exactly the same size and positioning inside of the frame here of the image. So all of the ones that I did, I just did in exactly the same way. And the effects are the same effects as I did on the logo. And I would just hide the background here and save this out as a PNG file. And then I would go in and make sure that it's converted to a rasterizing it by right-clicking and choosing rasterize type and rasterizing the layer style, so that I could actually have the pixels and be able to use my my smudge tool to go in and make sure you're on the layer, to go in and actually smudge that out and create sort of this sort of blurry smudged effect. And initially I used that, and then I actually put the green layer styles, the glow and the stroke around this in order to make that even more prominent. And then the press, I just took the blurred one and grabbed a brush, made sure I had some bright red, and chose a splatter brush to create some splatters on top of that. And you know, you could concentrate them a little bit, and that became my press effect. And again, hiding the background, saving this out, as just the splatter and the text effect here. And all of these would just be save as PNG. And once you do that, you're going to have 3 different images for each button. And you can see I actually have an extra one here because I did one without the green and one with the green for the hover effect. And I decided I like the one with the green better. So make sure that on each one of these, when you import them, you got to select them and change the import settings from default to, in this case, Sprite, 2D, and UI. Because when you're working with buttons, they're actually looking for a sprite. So you do that for each one of these. Make sure you set the max size. I use 1024 on all of these, and hit apply at the bottom of the inspector. So once you get that, you can then create a button. So to create a button, I'm going to go ahead and create one. It's in the UI area, just like creating a raw image, but it just says button. And when you create a button, it's going to, again, go somewhere, usually maybe the lower left screen where it's hard to see. So I want it right in the middle. I'm going to reset my transforms again to put it right in the middle. And you can see it's not really readable. It's the text on it's super small. And I could go in there and adjust that button, but I don't actually want to use that button. That button, incidentally, exists as part of the button level here, but also there's another level. You can see there's an arrow next to it. If you open it up, there's a text level, and the text on the button is here. Now, I don't actually want to use that text, and it is showing up. So I don't want that to come up on my custom button. So make sure you select the text field and back out of it so that just hit the backspace so that you get rid of that text. And you can see that now I just have the white square again, just like I did when I created a raw image, but now that's a button. So instead of changing the color of that button or scaling or anything, I'm going to put a custom image for it. And there are several fields here for that custom image. So the main one is under image. And you're going to use your main button. Just find one or name it, play button or something like that. And I'll do mine with the play button here. I'll go ahead and drag it in and drag it right on top of where it says source image. And when I drop it on there, I can see it changed in my game view, but it's hard to see. Again, hit set native size. And now I can actually see it. It's a little hard to see on that background where it is right now because there's a lot of stuff behind it, but I can see that it's there. And if I before I actually test it out, I'm going to plug in some of the other images that I've made here. So I have one with the green on it for the hover effect. Let's go ahead and drag that. Actually, let's drag the one that didn't have the hover effect, and I'll show you what that looked like initially. I'll drag it. I want to drag it on the part that says, before I can drag it over, I need to switch the type of transition that it's using on the button script. It says color tint. And I don't want to use the color tint one. I want to use the sprite swap. So I'm going to choose sprite swap. It gives me different fields to pull over the images that I want to use. And in this case, for the highlighted sprite, I'm going to pull over the green one and drop it in there. Actually, I said I wanted to do just the regular one without the green, so I'll pull that in. And then I want the one with the splatters to go where it says press sprite. You can see there's also a selected sprite and a disabled sprite. I'm not using those right now. So if we hit play, I should be able to see the button. There's a new play button. It's in the middle of the screen. And if I hover over it, you'll see that it blurs out. And if I press on it, it gets the splatter effect. But it doesn't do anything because it hasn't been hooked up to do anything yet. All it has is the images, and they're working fine. And then if I put the green in instead of the blur effect, it actually has the blur effect, but also has the green. Now, if I hover over it, it's blurring and it goes green. And the green is so noticeable that you almost don't even notice that it's blurring at all. And the splatter is still there. So the button's working fine. It's just not doing anything yet. So to make it actually do something, you're going to want to add the script to it. So I'm going to go ahead and add component, go to my scripts, and I'm going to find the menu button script. And that script has a couple of things to, or actually one thing to plug in. It's got 3 fields here. But 2 of the fields are already filled in because I've done that in the script. I knew what the names of my levels were going to be, so I went ahead and plugged them in the variables inside of the script, so they come up automatically. It just saves me some time. I don't have to type it out every single time. But if I wanted to change it, I could, and it would override what's already in here. But the splash GUI is not plugged in, and that is the image of the piece of paper with the bottle and the writing on it. So that's my backstory page, and that's created just the same way I've been creating things inside of Photoshop. You're just going to create it on a transparent background, and I created mine at a size of 1920 by 1080 because that's the size I'm using. That's like the default size for my game. I am using that as the default size, but I did go in and set this to change if I change the size. So, for instance, if I look at it at the default size, it's going to definitely be in the places where I want everything to be. But if I were to change that to say 4:3 aspect ratio, which is like an old style television set, you can see that the text actually moves and tries to stay in a good place, a relatively similar place on this new size. Now, it doesn't do that automatically. I'm going to go back. If I go to 16:9, it's going to be the same sort of thing. It's going to be closer to what I had in my 1920 by 1080. To do the 1920 by 1080, I actually went down here to the little plus symbol and typed in exactly what I wanted, width and height, 1920 by 1080, and set that. You can give it a name or a label if you want to also. I didn't. I just left it blank, and it came up 1920 by 1080 as a choice in here, and that's what I've been using. But the reason it scales is because on the canvas object, if you go to your canvas object, which all of your canvas UI stuff is child to, it has some parameters that you can set here that will make it scale with the size of the window, and so with your screen space. So that's under canvas scaler, and I'm setting it UI scale mode to scale with the screen size. So its default is constant pixel size, and that won't change. So if you're putting your game out to different um, screens, or someone has different monitors, then your text could get cut off, but it will try to resize it based on the size that the game is being built and played on. So that is something you probably want to set in here inside of the canvas. Okay, so going back to the play button that I'm making here, I created this button. I didn't name it. You'd want to give it some kind of name, play button or something. And then to make this button actually do something, adding the script is not enough. So, and I need to make sure everything's filled in on that script. I didn't actually drag over my splash screen that I wanted to come up. So I dragged that in, and it's a raw image, so make sure you use the right type. And then to make it actually work, you have to do something here on click. So there is a section above or below the button script that says on click, list is empty. And that's actually for making the button work. So to make that button work, you have to click the little plus symbol, and then you're going to get some controls here. This is visual scripting, so it's actually sort of a widget that allows you to enter stuff that will access your code in your menu button script. And you want to switch it from runtime only to editor and runtime so that it will work inside of the editor as well as when you build the game. And it says none object here where it says right below that. You need to plug in the actual button. So in this case, I would take this play button and drag it over and drop it where it says none. And then once you do that, it's going to read that object and the script that's on that object, even though it's showing up right here, it's reading it now into this on click, and it changes to no function. So now if you click on it, it lists everything that it found on that object in the scripts. And one of them is the menu buttons script. And inside of that, it will have a representation of all the procedures. And the one that I want for this play button is the play game procedure. And I'll choose it. Now it will run that play game procedure when I click the button. So let's try it out. If I hit play, I will go to the play button in the middle here that we just created, and I'll click on it. And if it's working, then it'll take me into my scene. Now it didn't, and I see an error message coming up. So it's saying missing component exception. There's no audio source attached to the play button. So you have to read your error messages. If you can't see them well, you can open up the console by clicking on the error message and reading it. If it's getting cut off, sometimes it doesn't print out the whole thing. It just printed out the first line. But I know what this means because it's a very descriptive error message. It's telling me that there is no audio source attached to the play button game object, but the script is trying to access it. So that's something I forgot to put on here, because I do play a sound in the script. And so I need to add component audio source. And it's actually, there's nothing to put an audio into the script. As you can see, there's no field for dragging audio into there. So there's not a public variable for the audio in that script. It's just going to play this audio source, and the audio should be plugged into it. So in my case, I have a couple of audios that I would choose for that in my sounds folder. And you'd want to create these or go find them at a free site like freesound.org. And in this case, I'm going to use a for a play button, it's going to immediately load up the scene. So the sound has to be short, unless you're going to use some kind of coroutine to have a delay. Your sound would have to be a very short sound. So I was using a sound which is pretty short, and I just called it play sound. And I'll go ahead and drag that in. And I don't want it to play on awake, so make sure you turn that off. And I don't want it to loop because it's only going to play once. And so it's a short sound, and if I hit play now for my game, I'll try it again, and I heard that sound. It's not a very loud sound, it's just kind of like a sharp kind of sound that gets cut off very quickly. But it brought me into my game, and here I am. So the button is working now. Everything is working on the button. There were no errors that time. And so to make more buttons, of course, I would want to place this button where I decide is the best place for it. And you're going to do that by typing in numbers in the position X and Y. Position Z is not going to do anything in a GUI, in UI space. So in UI screen space, X and Y is all you're going to be typing in. And maybe I would want this one to be a little lower, so I could put in Y maybe a negative number of, say, 200, and it would push it down towards the bottom. And maybe if I was placing all these across the bottom, I would want to put maybe 400, and that places it down in the grass, and I could then have another one to the left of that and one to the right of it. It's up to you. What do you think is going to be the best place for it? Make sure you test it out once you do it to make sure that it's coming up where you think it's going to come up inside of your actual game view. So you place it where you want it, and when you want a new one, you could create the new one from scratch again, but it's a little easier if you duplicate the button that you've made and then just change out the images and also change out the script. You don't change out the script, you use the same script, but you'll point it at a different procedure inside of the script. So if I want another button here, I can take the play button and just do Control D to duplicate it. Make sure you have it selected, Control D, and I now have a play button 1. And I could change that to say let's do a story button. So I give it the name story button, and it's going to be sitting right on top of the other play button. So if I go to my textures folder and find my story textures and I start dragging them in, I'll drag this first one over as the main one, and you can see it's coming up right on top of the play button. And I'll also want to bring over the highlight or the hover button and also the press button. And so it's sitting right on top of there, so I'll have to go and move it to the left in this case. I'm going to move it to the left. And so that's negative numbers in X, and let's try negative 300. And we'll try negative 500. Okay, so now it's to the left of my play button. and you can see the hover and everything is working. But it's not. It's going to actually take me into my scene because I didn't switch the procedure that it's accessing in the on-click section of the inspector. So go find the on-click component, and you notice if you look in here that it actually automatically switched to the story button. I don't have to change that, but I do need to switch on the right one here. I need to find menu buttons again and choose the correct procedure to run for this particular button, and that's the instruct game procedure. So I'll choose that. And now if I click the button, it will bring up the splash screen. So the only issue with that is I placed the splash screen on the left side here, so it's going to come up in front of this button. And actually, it's coming behind it, which is possibly an issue, maybe not. I mean, it might be fine there, but probably I like it placed with these on the right instead because they're not sitting on top of it anymore. So that's creating your buttons. Now, what we haven't talked about is the script that's controlling what happens when you click the buttons. So let's go take a look at that menu button script. We've seen how it works. The script itself, it has a couple of lines at the top because not only am I working with UI elements, I'm also loading a scene. So I'm loading the main level. So that requires a scene management. And then once you get into the variables, you'll see that I have two public strings. And the first one is set or assigned a string called main game level. And the second one, which is called load start screen, is assigned a start screen string. Now, string has double quotes around it. And these are the names of the levels for the start screen and the main game. And I'm actually using them both here. You definitely want to use the main game level one. You may not want to use the start screen one. It depends. I'm actually using it by sort of restarting it when I click on my splash screen at the end of the time of that showing up on your screen. And I'm doing that because it forces it to update. And you might not want to use that. It does restart that particular start screen level. And so if you have particle effects, they'll actually start over again. But it seemed like that was fine with what I was doing. So if you don't like that line or you don't want to use that, you can double put your 2 forward slashes in front of it and just comment that out. So that's an optional line here. But I do have, these are both public strings, so they are showing up in the inspector. If you want to change them to different names, you can, or you could put a different name inside of the script here if you're using different names for your levels. The next line says public raw image splash GUI, and that's for the splash screen with the bottle and the piece of paper that's coming up. And then there's a float timer, which is being set to 0.0f whenever you're using floats. You want to make sure that you put the decimal and an F on there. And this is actually the start setting for a timer to count off how long the splash screen should be up on your screen. And so it's going to start at 0. And then there's a time limit, and you set that to whatever you want it to be for the splash screen to be up there. You want it long enough that someone can read it. In my case, I made it 10 seconds. So if you don't have a lot of text, you might want that shorter. If you have more text, you might want it longer. And it is a public float so that it is coming up in the inspector, and you can change that if you want to. You have in start here, the splash GUI dot enabled is being set to false. So the splash GUI, it is a GUI object called splash screen, and you can see it's turned off by default. I've turned off the little checkbox next to raw image. It's always there. And if I turn it back on, you can see the bottle and the paper comes back up. So it's just being hidden all the time until you click the button and it unhides it. So you unhide and hide GUI images through this raw image checkbox, and in the code that is written as dot enabled. So if it's a GUI object that you're working with and you set the dot enabled to false, as I'm doing it here in the start, it's going to make sure that that's hidden when the game starts. And then I do have the timer in the update here. This is exactly the same as the timer that we used in for the text hints that I covered in previous videos when talking about the trigger zone scripts. And so we were using that to bring up some text on the screen for a text hint and then make it go away after a certain amount of seconds. And this one works exactly the same. I'll come back to it in a second. I'm going to go down to where the actual procedures are for making the buttons work. So there's 3 of them here. There's a play game, instruct game, and quit game procedure. And those are what we're referencing on the on-click component on the buttons. And they're very simple. There's just a couple of lines, 2 or 3 lines of code for each one. And the play game one is referencing the audio source on the object that this script is on. So on the buttons themselves, there has to be an audio source because you're running a get component command with game object and a lowercase g. That means the object, the game object that this script is on. And in this case, it's a button. It's a UI button. And so it's getting the audio source on it and playing it. So the audio source, the audio clip needs to be plugged into that audio source in order to hear anything. And then on the next line, it's running the scene manager.load scene load main game command. And that command is used to load a scene. This is what you want to use if you want to go to a different level, or if you want to restart your game, or in this case, you want to start your game by going from the splash screen level to the main game level. And so it's called scene manager.load scene. And the next one for instruct game, that's what's going to bring up the splash screen with the backstory or some instructions, whatever you want to do of the image, the 1920 by 1080 image of the bottle with the piece of paper that I made inside of Photoshop. So again, that's playing a sound in exactly the same way. And then it's setting splash GUI dot enabled equals true. And that just makes it visible. Now when that happens, when this becomes true, that's when the timer starts, because up here, update is always running in the game loop, and inside of update is a conditional statement that says if splash GUI dot enabled ever becomes true, then start the timer by doing a timer plus equals to time dot delta time. And that sets the game loop into the timer variable so that it starts ticking off, increasing time from 0. And once that becomes greater than whatever you set the time limit to, and that's the next if statement, then it's going to set the splash GUI dot enabled to false, which hides it again, resets the timer to 0, and in this case, I'm using an optional line to scene manager dot load scene for the load start screen again. Again, I'm using that because I was having trouble getting the instruction button to reset itself so that the hover would work after I clicked it once. So I clicked the button once and it wouldn't refresh so that the hover would work a second time. So I'm just reloading that start screen, which resets all of that and makes the hover button work again. You may not want to use that. You could put 2 forward slashes and comment that out if you don't want to use that. And then the last procedure in this menu button script is the quit game procedure, and it's doing the same sort of call to the audio source to play it, and it's running an application.quit command, which is going to quit the level if you build the game. It's not going to do anything in the editor. It's just going to ignore that. But if you're actually running a game build, it will quit the application. And then I've got a debug line in here so that when you see that, you know that the button did work. And then the last thing I want to mention is that there is inside of your game, if you are loading things, you want to go into your build settings and you want to make sure that you add the open scenes that you are loading. So you can see that I've added in my start screen and my main game level, and they're checked. And the start screen is 0 and the main game level is 1. And that's the order that you can drag these around up and down so that the first one, or the highest one here, is going to be 0 that's turned on. And you can see I've got some previous ones in here that I turned off as I created new updates to my scenes. So you just open it and add it in here and then make sure it's turned on, and the start screen should be the 0 one. We'll talk about building the game later, but that you want in here when you start to load stuff. Okay, so that is all the stuff for the menu buttons start screen, and make sure you put that in there. And now I'm going to go over the main game win sequence. So to start, I'm going to open up the main game level so that we can look more closely at both the win sequence and the booby trap, which is causing a death state and a restart, as well as the shark in the water that's also causing a death state and restart. So if I open up my booby trap section in my hierarchy and look at it, I have some bricks that are sitting at the top of my outpost structure, and they have a trigger that is an empty sitting down below them. So there's something called trap trigger, and if I look at it, it is a large green trigger that is right under the section where the bricks are sitting on top of a platform object that I've called trapdoor. And those bricks are just standard bricks that have a texture map that I created inside of Maya in a previous video, and there's a box collider on them and a rigid body that has gravity turned on that will allow them to fall to the ground, but they're being prevented from falling because of the trap door that's sitting underneath them. And so the only thing that's preventing them to fall is that basically platform that's sitting under them that also has a box collider on it. It also has rigid body on it, but it's got is kinematic turned on and use gravity turned off, so it won't fall to the ground. And it's preventing those from falling. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove it in order to have the bricks fall. Now the bricks themselves, the only thing which makes them dangerous to the player is that I have created a brick tag that I have put on these bricks. And that brick tag is what's going to be looked for when the collision happens with my player. Now I also need to go into the FPS controller and add something as well. Before I do that, let's take a look at how this works again. So if I run it and I walk over, if I don't notice that there is a platform up there with some bricks on it, or even if I do, there is a power-up object there that I want to pick up, but it's sitting within the volume of the trigger. And when I go to pick it up, I'm going to hit that, and those bricks are going to fall on my head, and I end up falling to the ground and rolling a bit. I actually fell to the bottom of the sea, and a screen comes up saying that I am dead, that a load of bricks fell on my head. So what's causing that to happen is a trigger that I've added on the FPS controller. So the FPS controller has a standard capsule collider on it anyway. And it actually doesn't even show up in the components of the FPS controller. So when I look at the FPS controller in my 3D view, I can see that there is the pill-shaped capsule collider, a big green collider that's going around the whole thing. And that's actually not showing up anywhere in my FPS controller components. That's actually sort of hidden and built into the FPS controller as a game object. I don't have access to that capsule collider. What I did was I added a second capsule collider to the FPS controller because I wanted to register a hit from the bricks to the head of my character. And therefore, I didn't want to do it with the regular capsule collider because that capsule collider is something where I could walk up to a brick that's sitting on the ground and stub my toe on it and die. That wouldn't be good. So I only want to die from a brick if it falls on my head. And therefore, I only wanted to register the trigger or trigger the collision at the top of my character. And there's no way to do that on the regular capsule collider. So I created a new capsule collider and I scaled it and I moved it so that it was at the top, sticking out from the top of my regular capsule collider. So it's this one here that has a trigger turned on. And if you look at the radius, it's a pretty small one. It's not really big. It's round. And it's sort of sitting at the top of my FPS controller above the regular capsule collider. It's intersecting it a little bit, but it's sticking out well above it as well. And it's been set to a trigger. And you just move that by just moving on the height or the position. Actually, I moved this capsule collider up positive 0.87 in Y. So it's it's a little bit less than 1 up in Y, and it's sitting right at the top of my character controller. So that's what's registering the collision from a brick, and it's a trigger, so it's going to be a different collision that's registering than it's something that hits the regular collider, because that's just going to be a collision. It's not going to be a trigger. I wanted to make it specific to the top of this character controller as a trigger so that I could isolate it inside of the script. So I'm going to go over and look at those scripts now. There is a player die script that you can see in my components right below my capsule collider that has the trigger on it. And it's got a lot of inputs to it. It's got a camera prefab that I'm calling dead cam. It's got a GUI object, a raw image GUI object that's coming up, and that's the screen that tells you you are dead. It's got a die sound that's being put into there and a water die sound. So I have a couple of different death events. One is to be eaten by sharks. The other one's to be hit in the head by a load of bricks. So I have two different sounds for that. The death one, the sound is splashing in the water. Like, you fall in the water, you're immediately going to get eaten by the sharks. And the other one is kind of a sound, like you get hit in the head. And then I have a restart object that I have plugged in. So there are some objects that I've sort of organized under the endgame stuff over here in my hierarchy. It's just an empty that I called endgame stuff. And in it, it's got the win object. It's also got a restart object. And that object is going to contain a script that is going to restart the whole game. And then, it's going to restart this level. It's not going to restart the whole game and take you back to the splash screen, the start screen. It's going to actually just reload this particular level. And then there's a text hints object that is telling me what kind of death I have if it was from a shark or a load of bricks. So all of those things are being plugged in. The text hints object we've looked at before. It's in Canvas. We've been using it in things like the trigger zone script. This one is just to give me a little bit more feedback in addition to the image that I bring up for when you die. So, because I'm actually using the same image for both the sharks and the bricks. So if I had different images, maybe I wouldn't need some text. So let's take a look at this player die script, and let's take a look at the booby trap script as well. So let's first take a look at the player die script. Well, let's take a look at the booby trap script first, because it's simpler than the player die script. So the booby trap script is on the trapdoor object that I have holding the bricks up. So if you look at that trapdoor object, in my components. Oh, sorry. No, it isn't. It's actually on the trap trigger, which is which is an empty that I created and placed underneath the trap door, and it's got um, a large box collider on it that's set to trigger, and it's got the booby trap script on it. So it's a hidden trigger because it's just on an empty, and it's got the power up object sort of sitting within the volume of that box collider. I just scaled up the box collider size so it's nice and big and stuck out, so that when you're walking on the side of the outpost structure to pick up this power up, you'll go through that trigger. And you won't know it's there until it actually goes off, but I do put some things in there to alert you to the fact that something's happening. Rather than just have the bricks fall, I do a little explosion using the explosion prefab and sound that we used all the way back in the tank game that is in a previous video. And then I'm putting in the trapdoor object, which is the object that is right above it, that is going to need to be removed in order to drop the bricks. So that's going in. And if we look at the script, that's what's happening there. You can see that it's just a standard script, no special things at the top. There is several public variables here. The first one being a game object public variable, capital G game object. So that's coming in with the trapdoor, and I'm going to want to destroy that in order to drop the bricks. And then there's a audio clip for the explode sound that's coming in, and a game object explode prefab that we've used before. The Boolean variable here, trap sprung, is to just keep track of whether this trap has been used or not. You don't want the trigger to keep going off every time you walk through it, because the trap, once it's sprung, it's not going to reset itself. So the bricks are going to be on the ground, and it wouldn't do anything if the explosion and the sound kept going off. So you need something there. And usually you use a Boolean for this because it's just something we can set to true or false to keep it from actually running again. And by default, of course, at the start of the game, I'm setting that to false. Trap sprung is set to false. And then on the trigger, it is going to check that. So the condition for the trigger to go off is, did you have a collision with the player? And has the trap not been sprung yet? So it says not trap sprung. You should know that the exclamation point means not at this point, and that's saying that it should be false. It's true if that variable is false, meaning it hasn't been sprung yet. And then if that's so, it will go ahead and spring the trap. And trap sprung is set to true so that this won't go off again. There's nothing to set it back to false, so it will, for the remainder of the game, remain true once it gets sprung once. And then it's going to instantiate the explode prefab right where I sort of right where the trigger is, down where the FPS controller is, and the audio source will play an explode sound, so you know something's happening. I wanted to alert the players that something's happening so that they have a chance to run through or walk or jump out so that they don't get hit by the bricks. Otherwise, they just get hit by the bricks every time. So I'm doing that by giving the explosion and sound, and then I'm also putting a slight delay on the destroy command for the trap. So it takes 2 seconds before it actually destroys. So if you didn't freeze when you heard the explosion sound, then you'd actually be able to not be hit by the trap. I could make the game harder by not putting any delay, no 2-second delay on the destroy command. That's how the destroy command works. It needs to know what the thing is that you want to destroy, in this case the trap, and then whether you want to delay for that to happen. And so I'm doing a 2-second float number for that delay. So that's the booby trap. And the player die script that's on the FPS controller is what is actually going to make you die. So the booby trap script is only making the bricks fall, and the bricks are tagged brick. So if they hit the trigger that's on the head of the FPS controller, then they're going to trigger this player die script to run. For that, you would also have to look at the FPS controller, because that's where the player die script is being placed. So make sure, because it is the player that's getting hit, it is the player that has the trigger on its head, it's the player that has to also have this player die script on it. And this script does have some UI stuff in it, because it brings up a "you are dead" screen, so you do need a unityengine.ui line at top. And then down in the variables, we're bringing in a camera prefab. So this rigid body camera prefab means that it's looking for a camera prefab that has a rigid body on it. And what that does, if I look back, I just created a new camera and placed it. It doesn't really matter where you place it, but you want it to be, it's going to be spawned right where your FPS controller camera is. And it's going to take the place of your FPS controller camera. And once you create it, you do want to put a rigid body on it. So if I go ahead and do that, let's say I create a new camera, you can see it replaces the view of my FPS controller camera in my game view. And that's not permanent. It will it'll go back if you don't go over here and set depth in the camera components of that new camera. If you don't set the depth from 0 to 1, then when you actually play the game, the FPS controller prefab might come back. So if you do set the depth to 1, it's actually going to be out in front of the Z depth of the camera space, and it will cover up any other cameras that are set to 0, which is the default for the FPS controller camera. So this will take priority and show up. You have an audio listener on this camera, on any camera that you create, and at the time that you create this, your character is dying. So the other camera on the FPS controller is actually going to be deleted, because the FPS controller is going to be destroyed. So there is possibly a millisecond where you might have 2 audio listeners in the same scene, but that will go away very quickly, and then the game will restart. So you will get a warning for that comes up if you leave the audio listener on here. If you take the audio listener off of this camera, it'll say, when you delete the other camera, it'll say you have to have at least 1 audio listener in your scene. and then it will restart. So either way, you're going to get some kind of warning. So I decided to keep the audio listener on this and not worry about that because it's only there for a millisecond, and then the game is restarted. So and once the game is restarted, you only have the FPS controller left. So this camera is what is going to allow you to, what is going to make it look like you're falling to the ground after you die. And I'm going to go and add to that a physics component, rigid body, because if you don't add a rigid body to this camera, it won't fall to the ground. You also want it to fall to the ground, but you need it to stop at the ground. You need it to hit the ground. And right now, there's nothing on this camera to keep it from falling through the ground and just keep going. So you have to also add in physics a box collider. Now I use a box collider instead of some other kind of collider like a capsule collider. I've tried a capsule collider, and the problem with that is it will just keep rolling and rolling and rolling if you're on a hill. A box collider will actually might roll if you're on a steep hill, but generally it will settle into place quicker. So it might roll one or two times. Unless you're on a steep hill, then it might roll all the way down. But a box collider will just allow you to keep from getting some crazy camera work happening when you die. So when you spawn that camera. So I'm using a box collider, rigid body with gravity turned on. And then I would need to make this camera into a prefab by dragging it into my prefabs folder. Now I'm not going to do that because I already have one there. I'm just going to delete this one. And once you do drag it to your prefabs folder, you're going to want to delete the one in your scene anyway. You don't want to leave it there. So that camera needs to be removed from your scene and placed in your prefabs folder. And I named my camera Dead Cam. So if I look in my prefabs folder, there is an object here called Dead Cam. And if you look at the components of it, it is a I did make sure that I placed the positions of the transform at 0, 0, 0, and I did rotate it a little bit because I wanted it when it fell to the ground to be at a slight angle for the box collider to hit the ground and sort of settle. Otherwise, it might just rigidly stop if it falls perfectly straight to the ground. So I did put some rotations in the transforms of that camera. The camera itself, I didn't really change anything on it. I did give it a wider field of view than the regular camera on the FPS controller. If I look at that FPS controller camera, it's got a setting of 60 field of view, and my Dead Cam has a setting of 90. So you're seeing more, and that's kind of interesting too, because when you get hit on the head, your whole field of view gets bigger. And it really makes it clear that you're seeing from a different point of view. And then it's got a box collider and a rigid body, and then the audio listener. So if we look at what that looks like, it's just a camera prefab that's has a box collider on it that's been angled so it will fall down to the ground when I spawn it and sort of hit the edge and maybe roll once or twice and then stop. So that's being spawned in the actual script that's on the FPS controller. So let's go back to that script, and the camera's coming in here. You plug the camera in from your prefabs folder, and I've got a Boolean is dead that's being set to false. By default, you're alive until you get hit by something, then you'll die. Again, you don't want to die more than once, not for a particular death. So you need to have something to keep that from maybe running multiple times. I have several public, 5 public variables here for a raw image. That's my GUI that comes up saying you are dead that I created inside of Photoshop. And it is an image that is set to 1920 by 1080. That's my sort of default resolution of my game. And so all I did was create some text like I've done before previously in this video, and did some paint brush splatter effect around the edge, and made sure that I had just transparency on it, deleted the bottom layer, and saved this out as a PNG file. Once you bring that into Unity, of course, you need to make sure that it's set to a editor GUI and legacy GUI, and whatever size it is. I used 2048 because it's a 1920 by 1080 image, which is 2048 is the next size up for that. So that's the image that's coming up. I'm bringing it in the script right here. I'm also bringing in a couple of die sounds, a game object for restarting the level, and a public text object for the text hints. In the start, I'm setting it that the GUI that I created there is going to be set to .enabled equals false. So that's the GUI that you have to make in order to plug that texture map into it. That's just going to be create a UI raw image, and we've done that several times, and mine's called dead GUI, and it's just got that texture map plugged into it. Remember that you have to set the native size. If you made it 1920 by 1080, it will fill up your entire screen. You also want to reset your transforms at the top so it's right centered in the screen. And that's always there. I'm just unhiding it. If I turn it on, you can see it's always there. It's just this checkbox is turned off. And in the script, I'm just enabling it. Or in this case, at the start of the game, I'm making sure that it's hidden by using false. Now, when the player hits the trigger for the brick, and I actually have a couple of different triggers. I've got one also for my shark, but it's all using the same script here, the same player die script. So if I go to my mini game and I look at the shark part, there's going to be a area over there. I've got some sharks that are just a model that I made inside of Maya, and brought it in and created a simple animation for it with a empty, a parent object, an empty placed over here, so that when I rotate that empty, it makes it look like the sharks are swimming in a circle. And I also set keyframes for that to go, for the fin to go up and down in Y, so it comes up out of the water and goes back down. That's basically an animation that you can see is on this empty. And if I go to the animation editor, you'll see all the keyframes for that. And if I play that, you can see that the shark fin goes around. It's really just animating the rotation and translation of that empty. It's translating up and down, it's rotating in Y as well. And I just copied the first keyframe to the last keyframe so it would be a loop, and then I just keep it looping. We've talked about animation before. I am using legacy animation for this, and I'm setting it to loop. So this shark object has an area that is in the water itself. So if I look at the environment, I've created a area called shark area. And if I zoom out, you can see it's really just an empty that I placed over here in the water where the sharks are. And I added a box collider to it and I scaled it up to be really big so it covers the entire water section from one side to the other and is basically down at the water level. So that if you fall in the water there, you're going to hit that trigger. It's set to a trigger. You're going to hit it as soon as you go into the water. And actually, because it's a trigger, it's not until the head of my character hits it. I set it to a trigger because I wanted to make sure that my FPS controller won't stop when it hits it. If you don't set it to a trigger, it's just going to be a collider. And when your FPS controller, say, jumps off the platform into the water, it's just going to stop like you're walking on water because the collider of the main collider on the FPS controller will not go through it if this box collider is set to a collider and not a trigger. So you turn on trigger so it will fall right through it. But when the head trigger on the FPS controller hits that, which means right as you're going into the water, then it's going to trigger the same player die script. So in this player die script, you're seeing a couple of conditional statements. First, it's checking at the very top of this trigger. It's saying if you are not dead yet. So not is dead. So you haven't died yet. And the next if statement is checking to see is what collided with the trigger tagged brick. And if that's true, it's going to do the stuff that's inside the curly brackets here. And if it's false, it's going to drop down to this else if, and it's going to check and see if it was tagged shark. And if either one of these things becomes true, then it's going to start running the death sequence. And the death sequence is playing some audio for you dying, depending on what kind of die sound it is. And it's playing clip at point, so it's actually playing where you are. And then it's setting is dead to true. That way, this won't run more than once, right? So if you get hit by one brick and then you get hit by another brick, it's not going to run twice. The first brick that hits you is going to make it true, and then it's not going to run the whole death sequence again. And then text hints is being used just like we've used it in other scripts to say a load of bricks fell on your head or sharks ate you, depending on which one you're doing here. And then you are dead is running, and that is a procedure. You know, if something has parentheses after it, it is a procedure, and that is a custom procedure. You are dead. That is the next thing in the script. And that procedure is enabling the dead GUI, which says you're dead, and it's instantiating the camera prefab, the dead head prefab, and it's destroying the FPS controller after a couple of seconds. So because this script is on the FPS controller, you need a couple of seconds if you want to hear some of the sounds complete. Otherwise, you might cut them off because you're going to see whatever the camera, the new camera, the deadhead camera is seeing. So it'll look like you died. And you'll see the images coming up. But the sounds are being played actually on this FPS controller. So if you were to destroy it too quickly, those sounds would get cut off. So I'm giving it a couple seconds delay before it actually destroys the controller. And then it's running this debug line that goes to the command console that says you have died. And you'll see that in the lower left of your screen. The last thing it's doing is it's restarting. It's sending a message to the restart object to restart the level. And restart level is a procedure inside of the restart object. We've used send message before for things like text hints. This one's doing it with a restart object. So let's look at that object. The restart object is here under my endgame stuff. It is an empty. You just created in the middle of the world. It's got the script on it, and it's got an audio source with a sound plugged in for restarting the game. Whatever sound you want to use for that. And if I look at, in my case, if this is a death, I put something like a wah, 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 like some kind of sound that you failed, a failed sound. And it's not a win sound like I use with the win script at the end of the game. So if we look at that script, it's using the Unity engine scene management because you have to load up the scene again. You're going to load the same level again. And that's coming in through a public string at the top. You just specify this level that you're on. And then it's running a coroutine to restart the level. Now, the reason I'm using a coroutine here, you use a coroutine which starts with IEnumerator, and it's called restart level. It's just like a regular procedure, except it has a yield statement. So a yield line is going to allow me to pause for a certain amount of seconds. So if I'm playing a you failed sound, and because the computer runs so fast, if I just use a regular procedure, it's going to restart it before even a little bit of that sound gets played. So if I want to hear that whole sound, I have to look at how long that sound is and create a delay that will allow you to sit there and wait for that sound to play. So I'm doing that, and you're seeing the You Are Dead screen. And after 10 seconds, it goes ahead and restarts the level. So restarting the level means you have to reset all your global variables. So any global variables that you have need to be reset, because I'm not quitting the game and restarting it. I'm just restarting the level where it began. And global variables are persistent through that. So if you change some things, if you won some games and stuff like that, then those will be still the same. And that could be good if you don't want to go all the way back to the beginning. You know, if you don't want to go back to the beginning, maybe you want to leave those the same. But if you do want to start the whole level over, then you need to reset all of those global variables to their original settings. And then after that, There's a couple of commented outlines here that I'm just were old ways of loading up the level. I'm using the current way, which is a scene manager load scene, and that's being done down here at the bottom. I'm also taking the cursor and unlocking it because you actually go over, actually in this case that probably doesn't matter, but if you were restarting into the say the menu screen, then you'd want a cursor so you can click the buttons, and if you don't unlock it, it won't be there. But actually this one can probably be turned off because you're starting back into the same level, which is going to have the, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it works fine. It unlocks the cursor here, and then it relocks it again when you start the level because of the FPS controller. That's one of the things the FPS controller does. So you can move your mouse around without seeing a cursor. You're just looking around. And then it's got a debug line at the end here for welcome to the island of Dr. Moreau. So that's the death script and the death sequences that I have in my game level. Next, we want to move on to the win state. So let's begin looking at the win sequence by going and opening up the power-ups, and I'm going to take my first power-up here and duplicate it so that we can more easily get to the win sequence. So the win sequence is triggered by getting 4 power-ups. So let's just duplicate this one a few times. So that we can easily get those 4 power-ups. And let's take a look at the win sequence before we see how it was created. So if I play, I'm going to grab my 4 power-ups. And when the door opens, I'm going to jump up and grab the torch. And I want to walk over here. And I'm going to throw the torch to light the fire, which triggers the win sequence where I can see the help written out from the logs, and it resets the game and takes me to my start screen. So that's my win sequence. Once I get the signal fire lit with the logs that spell help on the ground, then I get the animation of the camera flying up into the sky to where the plane is, and where I can see a message saying that I've won, that I'm rescued. Okay, so in order to get that, I have to get the torch. And the power-ups are what let me get into the outpost to get the torch. So if I open up the outpost, I can see that there's the rock in there, which is kind of floating and spinning, and I created that inside of Maya. So if I zoom into it, we can see that there is a 3D rock object here that has a torch stuck in it, and it's got a green light on the top of it. And the main thing that, I mean, the spinning rock, that's nothing but a script on it, the same kind of thing that we put on the power-up objects to make them spin, a line to control their transform rotation, and the torch is child to that. And what I want to do is get into this. Once I get through the door, I need to hit a trigger that will give me the torch. So, and run a script called torch pickup that is on the rock. So the torch pickup is actually not on the torch, it's on the rock, and that is, I guess there's not really I could have put it on the torch also. The torch itself is, the reason I didn't put it on the torch is because I'm going to get rid of the torch here when I collide with the collider that's sticking out of the rock. So I've got a trigger here, and the trigger is sort of positioned. It's a capsule collider, and it's additional capsule collider. So there's actually two capsule colliders on the rock. One so that I could actually stand on the rock if I jump up there, and another one that's smaller and sort of in the shape of the torch, but bigger than the torch. So it's actually quite a bit bigger than the torch, and it's sort of sticking out of the rock, and that's got a trigger turned on. And so the torch pickup script, the way it's working is I'm not actually picking up this torch. This torch is just for show. So it's a static torch model that I brought in with the rock and the rest of the outpost. I just imported it all together, and that's an object that I just hide when I grab the torch, when I jump up there and collide with this trigger. So let's go ahead and take a look at that torch pickup script. So again, this is on the rock, and what I have is 3 public variables. One is for the rotation speed of the rock. Another is for the torch itself, game object, rock torch. And one is for the public static Boolean torch picked up. So public static means it's global, and it's global because I need to register that the torch has been picked up. Once I get that, then I go down and set torch picked up to false as the default state. So until I actually get into the outpost to jump up there and collide with the trigger, I don't have the torch yet. And when I come down here, the trigger part is what's going to, on trigger enter, that's a built-in procedure into Maya that we've used many times. And it's for if I have a trigger on this particular object that the script is on, and it's looking that if I collide, if the rock trigger collides with something tagged player and the torch picked up is false, it's not true yet. So if that's the case, if we haven't picked up the torch and my player jumps up and collides with that trigger, then it sends a message to the object that collided, which is the player, to run the torch pickup procedure. So this is actually working exactly the same as the cell pickup procedure that we used at the beginning of the semester with the class assets and the tutorials from the textbook. In this case, I'm changing it to a torch pickup. And that means that there's a procedure in the inventory script, or in my case, the inventory torch script, to pick up the torch. And it's setting torch picked up to true here, so that's a global variable. And that's important because I have other scripts for registering whether I'm holding the torch or not. So like I have to be holding it in order to throw it. And so I'm going to throw the torch in order to light the fire, and I need to register whether I have it in my hand. I can throw the torch and it not hit the fire and go on somewhere on the ground, and I can go pick it up again. So I also have a torch re-pickup script. So this torch picked up variable is global because it needs to be recognized in several of these scripts. So here I'm setting it to true to say that I have picked up the torch, and I've got a debug line also going to the command line for that. And then I have a destroy command to get rid of the rock torch. So the one that's sticking out of the rock is being destroyed. And that's the reason why I didn't, I put the trigger on the rock instead of the torch, because I knew I was going to destroy the torch, not just hide it. So if I was hiding it, I could have just put it on the torch itself. But there's several ways of doing things with anything that you do, and if it's, if it seems logically that one way might be better than another, then you just have to choose one. Or if they're both the same, you have to choose one. Otherwise, you would choose the one that seems better to use. So that's how I'm picking up the torch. Now, inside of Unity, once I collide with this torch gets destroyed immediately. And the reason it looks like I've picked it up and it has fire, because this one has no fire. It only has the green light, and that's actually child to the torch itself. It's called rock light, and it's being plugged into the script along with, actually it's not being plugged into the script, but it is moving with this because it's child to it, and that just produces some interesting lighting effects inside of this structure. And again, it's rotating because inside of update of that torch pickup script, I have this transform.rotate command, exactly the same as in the power up objects and the PowerCell script. So those are just rotating endlessly as long as the rock exists. And I pick up the torch and it's in my hand at that point. So it's actually already in my hand. There is a torch holder child to my FPS controller. So if I go double click my FPS controller, we've done something where we've thrown axes, and that was child, a launcher object that's child to the first person character camera on the controller. And you can see I also have a headlight that I've made child to that as well, so that I can see a light when I'm looking around. But this torch holder here is child to the FPS controller directly, which means it doesn't move with my camera. It always stays steady kind of in front of my FPS controller. It's to the right of my FPS controller, so it's like I'm holding the torch with my right hand, and I've rotated it so that it's angled a little bit forward and to the right. So the torch, when it is shown, which it's already there. There's a torch prefab already there, and it's hidden. So if I unhide it, for instance, by turning it on next to its name in the inspector, you can see that checkbox is turned off. If I click on it to turn it on, it will show that torch. It also shows the light. There's a light child to the torch, as well as there's a fire object child to the torch. So as soon as I turn on the torch prefab, the fire object will also start, but it starts through the script. You can see it's actually turned off right now. But if I go into that fire object and turn it on, well, actually, let's take a look at that. That fire object is part of a prefab that I created. And in order to do fire, you are going to want to do particles. So if I go find that fire prefab object that I'm using there, it's in my prefabs folder, and if I open that prefab, you can see what the fire looks like. So here's my fire. It's got some smoke as well, and this is actually, if I open the editor here, you'll see that there's actually two objects here. The smoke is child to the fire, so that if the fire starts, the smoke automatically starts with it. And the settings for these are what's making it look like fire. So we've got different emission rates over time for each one of these. You can see that, say, duration, for instance, on the fire is lower than the smoke, which means the smoke goes a lot further than the fire does. If I zoom out there a little bit, so you can see the fire is very short, the smoke goes all the way up here, and that's the duration being longer on the smoke than on the fire. A lot of these settings will be created when you create the particle system, but things like duration you have to put in. I didn't change anything else. Oh, I did change the start size for these, and start speed. So you can see you have 1.2 start speed for the fire and 1.5 start speed for the smoke. So the smoke is moving slower than the fire, and the size of the fire is also smaller at 1.5 than the smoke, which has a start size of 2. So you've got bigger particles with the smoke, you have smaller particles with the fire, and under emission, we've got actually more fire than smoke over time. We've got 20 for fire for rate over time and 15 for smoke. And then we have the shape of the cones. We're using a cone shape as the emitters, and you can kind of see that there. And we're setting a 5 angle, 15 radius for the fire, or sorry, 0.5 radius for the fire and 0.8 radius for the smoke emitter. And that's just the width of it. So they're very similar. The fire's a little smaller. And then what's making it actually look like these particular materials is the color. So there's a color gradient on the fire, and there is a color gradient on the smoke. And one side of this gradient is for transparency, the top side here, and the bottom side is for color. And same thing with the one that's in the color over lifetime for the smoke, only it's all grayscales. So when you're working with these, you have to open them up, some of them which are collapsed, and you have to go in and turn them on with the little checkbox. I'm using size over lifetime and also using rotation over lifetime, and each one of these, if I click on it, you can see what the curve looks like for the fire. And really, this one for, say, size over lifetime, this kind of a curve means that the fire is starting at 0.5, it's going up to 0.75 or so, and then it's going back down to like 0.35 or so. And so this is a scale going from 0 to 1, and the size is, in this case, getting bigger and then going back to smaller again as it goes further up in its lifetime. And the smoke has a different curve which just gets bigger over its lifetime. So the smoke gets bigger, it doesn't get bigger and then smaller. And that actually creates kind of the shape of the overall particles effect for each one of these materials. And if I look at rotation over lifetime, you can see I've got a curve for the fire that looks like that. That's creating like a swirling effect. And the same kind of thing with the smoke. I'm doing kind of a swirling effect. And what actually makes these look like smoke and fire is under the renderer, is I'm using billboard sprite for a texture map. So a billboard sprite texture, particle texture, is always going to face the camera, and so it's a flat 2D image that looks like smoke or fire, and it's put into a material. So you have to make a material for it, a fire material and a smoke material. If we go look in we close this and we look in my textures, or actually my materials, to find the fire material that I'm using, it looks like this. And I'm just using the fire ping that I had in my class assets. But you might have more than one. We imported standard assets, so there's actually several different kinds of textures in here that will make a good smoke, and in some cases fire texture. So here's a particle fire right here, and there is a particle smoke as well. Here's a smoke texture map. So if you don't have one, it's just basically transparent around the colored effect, and you're using a particles shader, and you're using additive soft. So it's basically creating a nice soft transparency effect around the actual colored area on this particle shader. So when you're working with the actual system, you'll be able to see it. And you do all that by creating it. So if I wanted to, for instance, create a new particle system, let's say right here inside of my 3D space, I would go to create and choose effects, particle system. And you'll see that it creates an empty that is emitting the particles. And you can see it's running in real time, and I can see what those particles look like. And when you create it, you're going to see the system and the inspector, and you can move it. Normally, I would parent this under some kind of object like the top of my my torch, and angle it so that it's going to be coming out from the top of the torch. And then you're going to want to start working on the particles themselves, and it's often easiest to open the editor to do that so that you can see all the different settings in here. There's quite a few of them, and you also want to be able to see your curves and stuff on the far right here. So if you want to create additional particle systems, like first you want to create the fire and then you want to create the smoke, you click the little plus sign to the right of the particle system that you're working with. But if I was going to try to make this look like fire, I'd want to go ahead and start typing in the different settings that I talked about. So maybe I would set this to 3 for the start lifetime and the start speed 1.2. And you can see as soon as I start typing things in there, it starts to look different. So I decrease the start speed, and now it looks very different. And the start size is a little different now. And then I'll go to the emissions, and we'll increase the amount of particles by setting it from 10 to 20. Now we're getting a lot more particles. And we'll go down to rate over time, 20, and then we want to look at the shape of this. We're using a cone, and we can see the cone as soon as we open up shape. It shows me the cone, and let's say I set that down to maybe a 5, and that's going to make a smaller cone where the particles are coming out. And the radius, I'm going to decrease the radius to 0.5 from 1, so it's even smaller. And you can see that they're kind of coming out from the bottom of that cone. And then what I want is to go over to the color over lifetime. I want to turn that on, open it up and turn it on. And I'm going to also want to do size over lifetime. Turn that on and open it up. And so when I do that, it automatically, you can see the particles change. They're using the curve that's already in here, and I can see that it's by default using a curve. And if I turn it on, I don't even turn it on. If I just select it, I can see that it's using sort of a linear curve. So they're going from really, really small, like 0, up to 1 in a straight line. And you can see that on the particles themselves. And there's different presets that you can click on to get different effects. So this one is kind of starting really small and then getting bigger quicker. And this one is starting small but getting bigger very fast. And this one is kind of an S-curve, which means it's starting slow, speeding up, and then slowing down like we've seen before with an ease in and ease out type of thing. And so if you remember, I kind of started my particles out up here around 0.5, so they didn't start really super small. And I added a key in the middle here by right-clicking it and inserting a key and bringing that up and then dragging the end key down. So they actually get smaller at the end than they even were when they started out. So that's kind of the shape of the curve that I did for mine. They start small, get bigger, and then get small again. That creates a different shape for the type of material that this is. And that starts to become more like a fire shape. And you can move this around and immediately see what effect that is going to have. So let's say I like that, and I'm going to go with that one. And then to make it look even more like fire, I would want to give it some color over lifetime. And in that case, I'm going to want to kind of have a gradient that goes from sort of warm colors. So I would add at least, I'm sort of just clicking with my mouse here to add some color swatches. And they're plain white right now. And I'm going to want corresponding kind of alpha channel or transparency ones at the top too. So, and you can add as many as you want to control what the gradient's going to look like. And for this, I know that I would want to sort of start off with a red and then maybe go to a yellow. So this one here would probably be something like a really warm, sort of bright yellow. And this one right here would be, as I'm clicking on the little tab, and then I'm clicking on the color swatch and setting the color by just dragging and moving things around. You can do the HSV, the hue, saturation, and value if you want, but I might want something like a sort of more reddish one, orangish red, all the way up again towards the bottom. For the first one, I might want that to even like really hot fire is somewhat bluish sometimes. I might want some blue in there. at the beginning, but I don't want that to show up very much, and mostly it's going to be transparent. So my alpha for that one is probably going to be almost all the way down, if not all the way down. So if that blue shows up at all, it's going to barely show up. And then the next one, I want that to be probably somewhat transparent, but mostly opaque. And then the next one, just maybe a little bit opaque. And then this one, I know at the very end is going to be all the way transparent. And this one is going to be somewhere in the middle. So, I mean, I might even want to take that one out. Color on this probably would be still kind of an orangish, yellowish color. Maybe something like that. So now I see a full gradient. The most opaque one is the yellow, and I might even want to pull that back a little bit. And going towards transparent up here. And that creates the color that I would want for the fire, but it doesn't create the look of the fire. So the look of the fire is going to be more in the renderer at the bottom with the texture map that the billboard texture that I put on it. Before we get to that, you're going to want to do some rotation over lifetime and to make maybe some kind of a swirling type of effect. There's a lot of things you can experiment in here. You might want some noise and some rotation by speed, external forces. There's various things that you could turn on here. If I turn this one on, you can see it has an angular velocity to 45, but I would prefer to use a curve and just create like a swirling effect by just right-clicking and adding some keys and just kind of making it look somewhat random in the way that it's going. Because it is fire, creating some kind of swirling type of effect might look good. And the nice thing about this is that you can just move it and take a look and see what the effect is. And you may not be able to see it fully unless you actually go in and put the texture map on it, the billboard texture. So to create that, I showed you need to create a material. And I already have a material, so let's go ahead and put it on there. And we're going to choose the particle fire material. Now you can see that there's several in here that I actually didn't make. They came in with the standard assets. And I could try them out. I could click on them and see what they look like. That's a kind of interesting one. It's a bunch of different textures repeating, which creates an interesting effect, almost like something you might want to use in some kind of like a lighting effect or something. This is a particle fire that was in the standard assets. And you can see it's a little bit heavy. I probably wouldn't want to use that one. And there's a bunch of smoke ones here too. So those all came in with the standard assets. I have the one that I made that I'll go ahead and click on. There's a couple of ones. They're pretty much the same. And you can see that the billboard texture that it's using is creating a look of, well, that's leaves, so that's kind of interesting. But the effect is combining the billboard texture with the color over lifetime that I put in there. So it's combining both those things, and you'll be able to see the swirling effect of the particles more once you get the texture on there. That's kind of nice right there, pulling this kind of out. And you can just move it around and it will update to give you different effects. And you can do the same thing with the size over lifetime. If we go to that, I can just grab this and move it around and see what it does. Now, if I'm doing a torch, maybe I don't want it to be too crazy or too big at the end. Maybe I want it to be much bigger down near the base of the torch and get smaller towards the outer part. So that can be my torch fire right there. So if I want to, like I said, create another particle for the smoke, then I can go to the top here and hit the plus symbol, and it'll create another system, and I can move it towards the top here and adjust the different settings to what would look like smoke. So that's how you can create your particle effects for a torch or a campfire or whatever it is you're making in your game. You can change the colors. They don't have to be orange. You could have green fire or purple fire or some other kinds of colors, whatever you want. And then you can parent that system under something. So I'm just going to take this system and delete it because I've already got one that's child to the torch that I have in my hand. So let's take a look at what's happening when I pick up the torch. So we saw that when you picked up the torch in the script, that it did a send message to torch pickup on the player. And so if I go open up the script that I have on the player, in my case it's called inventory torch. Let's go ahead and open that. There are a few things that I've added to my inventory script here that you can see in the script and also in the inspector. So here is where the player die script is. We already talked about that. I added in a place to put a torch prefab that I created for throwing the torch. So the torch already exists in your hand. You're just going to reveal it. But when you throw the torch to light the signal fire, you're actually hiding the one that's in your hand and spawning and throwing a torch from a launcher object, from the torch holder. And you're doing that because the one in your hand doesn't have gravity on it. It's basically just parented to your FPS controller, so wherever you walk, it's going to be there. It's not child to the camera, so you can look down at it if you want to. But and if we play this and we look down, we can see there's the torch fire coming out of it, and we can look around. Wherever we look horizontally, it will go with us because that's actually turning on your FPS controller itself. But the up and down part is actually on the camera. And since it's not child to the camera, I can look down at it. You can also see that I don't have a hand. And I can look up and see the smoke. So that's always there in my hand, and it's hidden. That torch prefab is hidden. And it's being revealed when I pick it up. And if we look in the script, we've talked a lot about what's already in this inventory script. So we've talked about all of this, all of these variables for the main part of the game. But what I've added in here is a public game object on this line, public game object hold torch, and that's to put in a torch prefab. And when we go down a little bit further, you'll find after the cell pickup that I was using to pick up the different power-up objects, I have a torch pickup. And it's a custom procedure, no arguments going into it, no return statement coming out of it, which is why it says void, and there's nothing in the parentheses. And then it's doing what's in the lines inside of the curly brackets, so it's playing a sound, and it's a sound for picking up the torch. And then it's taking the hold torch.set active and setting it to true. Now we've seen this before. This is what actually how you write in your code to check this box next to the name of torch prefab. And that's what that's doing. When you set that to true, it checks the box, and when you set it to false, it turns off the box. That doesn't just hide it, it completely disables it, because you want to disable it because there's a fire and there's other stuff underneath it, and you don't want those running. So you just disable the whole thing with this set active line. And when you set it to true, that's turning it on. It's making it visible, making the fire start. Actually, the fire is not set to start by default. So there is a separate line for getting the component of the particle system. It's basically looking through the entire children of the FPS controller. That's why it's looking get component in children and trying to find the particle system. And there's only one particle system child to the FPS controller, and it's the one on the torch. So when it finds it, it's playing it here. And then it's also getting the component for the audio source that's on the torch itself, and it's playing that as well. So that's just a little bit of a fire sound. And it is set to, that audio source is set to 3D sound, so it'll make the sound close to you, to the right of you, because that's where you're holding the actual torch. So that's how you get the torch coming up in your hand. And then where this is, this hold torch is coming up in order to find it, to make it active. It's not for throwing it. So the throwing part is actually in a separate script called throw torch, and that script is placed on the actual launcher object, I believe. Let's take a look at that. Yeah. So yeah, I have a torch launcher for that script is on. So I have several launchers on, or several scripts for throwing things on this FPS controller, because we had a coconut thrower mini game earlier that I have a coconut thrower script, and it's still there. If I brought that up, I could throw coconuts. And I also have an axe thrower um, script on that for the mini game that I'm currently using. And so I created another empty for the torch launcher. And I did that because it needs to be thrown from a different place, right? It's angled in differently. You don't want it to be thrown exactly from the same place as the torch holder, because the torch holder is optimized for sort of viewing the torch in front of the FPS controller. And it's really not scaled accurately. It's kind of really big, but it looks right in the camera view when the torch is in front of you. So the launcher is launching a torch from a slightly different angle. So when you throw a torch, you're hiding the one that's in your hand, and the other one launches in the exact same moment, and it looks like you're throwing the torch. But I sort of took this empty and angled it so it would be optimized for throwing it kind of out in front of me. And it works the same as the other shooter scripts that we've used. So for the axes and for the coconuts, you can see I'm even using the coconut throw sound in here. So I've got a torch prefab in there. That is a prefab that I made for the torch that has the fire and everything in it, and it's got gravity on it. And I made it into a prefab. So it's got all of the stuff on it that I need if I throw a lit torch. And if you look at the actual object, it's got rigid body on it with use gravity turned on. It's got a sound for the fire. And it even has a firelight flicker script, because there's a light here that I wanted to look like it was flickering like fire. If you don't have a light on your fire, it won't actually illuminate the environment around it. The particles are not really doing that. So I created a point light, put it at the end of it here, made it child, and then input it into this this firelight flicker script. You can see it's being put into the light is being put into the components here. So that's creating random values between 3 and 4 to control the intensity of the light. So to make the light go up and down a little bit. If you go crazy with it, it will look like a strobe effect. But we'll take a look at that script inside of, let's look at that first actually. So I'll go to the firelight flicker script, and you can see that the light is being brought in as the first public variable here. There's also a float light flicker, and this is for the intensity value that you're going to generate with the random range command. So you need some kind of float variable to put that in. And then you're bringing in the light as a light variable, public variable, and then you're also doing a public float, min value and max value. And I just knew that my light needed to be around 4, and I wanted it to flicker between 3 and 4. I tried between 2 and 5, and it was too much, so I reduced it down to just sort of 1 degree of difference there. And it is a float, so these are decimals. It's going to go generate a number like 3.6, and then it's going to generate another number like 3.9, and it's going to flicker every game loop. And so the light flicker value is being set to 1 to start off with, which is actually pretty low. But then in update, every game loop, it's going to generate a random range value. So this is a built-in command, random.range. You can look it up in the Unity documentation. The arguments into it are a min value and a max value. And it's looking for floats. So I gave it 3 and 4 at the top. And then it generates the number out and puts it in the light flicker variable. And then that light flicker variable is setting the firelight dot intensity. So firelight is the light itself. So it's using the dot syntax here to set the intensity of that light every game loop. And that'll just give a more realistic feel to your light as you see it flicker and on all the stuff around the fire. And so if I want to throw that torch, I have a throw sound that I'm putting into the script. I've got a prefab that I created for the torch itself that I just showed you. And that's in my prefabs folder, so I can instantiate that prefab whenever I want to throw a torch. It's really no different than throwing an axe. It's just got inside of the prefab the torch model, the light, and the fire system, the particle system. So I have a throw speed just like we have in our other shooter scripts. And I've got a Boolean for whether I have the torch or not. This is actually going to be looking at the global variable that was in the other script and setting it. So I need to, again, know whether I'm holding the torch in order to throw the torch. If I'm not holding the torch, I can't throw the torch. But once I have the torch and it's in my hand, I can always throw it. So there is also a public game object for the hold torch, the container for the thrown torch. So in this case, this is not the torch prefab. This is going to be the thing that I'm throwing the torch from, I believe. Let me just check. So actually, looks like I'm not actually using that. But let's go through this, and I think I was going to use it, but I think I decided not to. So let's look at what's inside of the procedures here. We have a start where I'm setting has torch to false. So I don't have it to begin with, but where I'm looking for whether I have the torch or not is from the torch pickup script. So I'm starting it has torch to false just to give it something, because I know that's what also that's set to inside of the torch pickup. But once I start the game in update, this is going to be continuously looking towards the torch pickup script and the global variable called torch picked up or torch picked up. So this is dot syntax, which is referencing that global variable. And if it ever turns to true, it's going to be put into has torch. And then that's what it's going to be looking at in this if statement here. If I push input get button up fire 1. So we know that if you look inside of your edit project settings, that you have an input section that if you open it up has all of the built-in setups for all of the inputs coming into the main inputs coming into your Unity game. So Fire 1 is one of those, and it's referencing the left control and mouse 0, which is our left mouse button. So this Fire 1 is what all of our shooter scripts are looking for me to shoot something or throw something. And that's just basically looking at the left mouse button or the left control. And there's a lot of other things here. Jumping is set to the space bar, and all of those different things are set in there in your game. And you can come in here and you can make new ones by typing in 19. It'll create a new one. Then you can create more inputs, or you can change any of these inputs if you want to. But we're going to leave them at the defaults. And that's what that script, all our scripts actually, are using when we're looking at input.getButtonUpFire1. That's referencing that left mouse button or the left control button in my case. So if that's true, meaning I'm pressing the left mouse button, and has torch is true, meaning that we've picked up the torch, then it allows me to do the throwing of the torch. And that's basically taking hold torch, set active to false, meaning it hides the one in my hand. Not just hides it, but actually deactivates it, so everything will disappear. And at the same moment that happens, it's going to instantiate a new torch from the torch prefab that I'm inputting. And it's doing it on this torch launcher object that the script is on. So I am bringing in hold torch at the top here, the game object that's coming in, because that's what I need to deactivate the one that's in my hand, and also stop the particle system that's going, and also stop the audio that's going on that one. So all of these first 3 lines here are getting rid of the torch that I'm holding in my hand. It's still there, it just is, everything is turned off. And then it's instantiating the new torch, which has gravity on it. So when I instantiate that and catch it in this rigid body variable and name it torch, then I can use the dot velocity dot syntax, the class syntax for the physics, to actually launch it forward. And that's transform.forward times the throw speed, sends that torch forward in the z-axis, positive z, and then it's playing a throw sound. In my case, it's just the sound of a whoosh type of sound that you're throwing with your arm, or you're hearing the fire throw. And then has torch is being set to false. So that's important, because if I don't have the torch in my hand anymore, then I can go pick it up again. And it's important that I send that back over to the global variable, which is torch pickup dot torch picked up. And has torch doing the assignment of my local variable has torch to that global variable, changes it, and tells that other script that I can now pick the torch back up again. Now it's a little different. I did create a separate torch repickup script. And I did that because the torch I'm picking up that I threw is different than the torch that was stuck in the rock. The torch stuck in the rock was just a model. Um, the torch that I throw is actually a rigid body, and so there's different things about it. So I made a second torch repickup, and that's what it's going to be using to pick the torch back up if you need to. If you throw it and light the signal fire, you won't need to pick it back up because you'll initiate the win sequence. If you throw it somewhere else or you miss the signal fire when you throw it, you can go pick it back up and throw it again. Okay, so this torch repickup script, it goes on the torch prefab. So it needs to go on the torch prefab because it's going to be looking for the player to collide with it. And it's not a trigger in this case, it's an on collision enter. And so I showed you the prefab. Here's the torch prefab itself. If I look at it, you'll see that it has the torch repickup script on it. It has no inputs. It's just used to pick the torch back up if you threw it. And if I look at what's happening there, it's got a Boolean for whether the torch is picked up or not, because we need to keep track of that. That's a local Boolean variable. And it's setting that to false by default. And in update, it's always looking back at that global variable torch pickup dot torch picked up to know whether the torch is held in the hand or not. And if I've thrown it, that should be false. And then when I walk over to it and collide with it with my FPS collider, it should register a collision. And if the torch itself sees that it collided with something tagged player and the torch has not been picked up yet, that global variable is false, then go ahead and send a message to run torch pickup again on the player, just like we did the first time. And it's just going to go through the same process again of unhiding the one in my hand, and it's going to unhide the one, or unhide the one in my hand, and set that I've picked it up to true, so this won't run again, and set the global variable also to true, and then destroy this game object. And that's the important line right there, because when I collide with it, the one that was on the ground needs to disappear at the same time it appears in my hand through the torch pickup script on my FPS controller. So this is destroying it. And all this happens so fast that it looks like I picked it up. Okay, so if you throw the torch and it hits the signal fire logs, then they are going to light all of the logs and run the win sequence. So part of that is that they're going to be looking, the logs themselves are looking for a collision with something tagged player torch. And you can see that my prefab that I have over here in the inspector, the one that I'm throwing, of the torch is tagged player torch. And that way I can look for that on the logs for the signal fire. And I've gone in and let's go ahead and go find those logs. So my logs are under signal fire logs, and I want to take a look at those. Each of these logs I wanted to light up if they collide with the lit torch, and once one of them lights, all of them has to light. So in order to do that, I wrote a script called light log, and then there is a script for lighting all the logs as well. So let's take a look at those. If you look at this, it does have a box collider as well as a capsule collider on each one of these logs. And the box collider is so that if I were to walk over here before I got the torch, then I could actually run into those logs or jump up on those logs. The capsule collider is going to be a normal collider for that fits right around the logs. And then the box collider is set to trigger, and that's a little bit bigger, so that when I throw the torch, if it hits this one of these triggers, then that particular log is going to light. And you can see that there's an audio source on the log as well that has the fire atmosphere sound in it from our class assets, and then the light log script that doesn't have any arguments in it. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that light log script. Let's go ahead and open it up. And we see that there's not very much in it, that it's a fairly simple script as far as the variables go. It's got a Boolean for whether the log is lit or not. And then I'm setting that down here in the start to false as the default. And then it's got a Boolean for signal fire is lit, and I'm also setting that to false by default in the start. Then inside of update, I've got several parts of the code that has to do with the signal fire itself. So it's always looking for logs to be lit in order to start the signal fire. So I had to decide, I wanted, no matter where you hit it with the torch, which log you hit, that log is going to light, and then the whole thing is going to light on fire, just like it just sort of went from one to the other. But it's not really going from one to the other. It's just turning them all on because it's checking to see if any one log gets lit, then the entire signal fire is going to get lit. So for the individual log, this particular log, it's looking in the on trigger enter to see if the log's trigger is collided with something that's tagged player torch and that the log has not been lit yet. So if that's true, then it's going to get a component of a particle system that is in the children of the log. So every log has a particle system on it. I made my particle system, my fire particle system, into a prefab, so I could just pull it out and place it on any object. And you can see that if I open up this log, there's a fire particle system, and it's been scaled out to fit across that entire log so that it will look like that entire length of that log is on fire. It's kind of scaled in one direction, and it's moved to the top of the log. So that looks like the fire's coming out of the top of the log. And that's just the same fire that I'm using for everything. For the torch, that's really all I have is the torch, but it's the same fire. It's just a different shape because I've scaled it. And I just did that through scaling the shape of the emitter. So you can see that in my scaling on the shape of the emitter, I've got the Z scaled up to 8.46. So Y, that's not the Z, that's the Y. X and Z are 1, and then Y, and you can see it's the green axis. You can see the arrow in the 3D view. It's the green axis that is the Y axis, and that's the one I've scaled up to 8.46. So so that tree log has fire on it, but they all have fire on it, and it's looking for that system in the children and playing it if the torch gets lit. It's also playing the audio source on there, which we saw was the fire sound, and log lit is being set to true. I've got a debug line to tell me that the log was lit, and then there is a global variable called inventory torch signal fire lit. It's in my inventory torch script that's on the player, and that's what it's always looking towards to see if any log in the signal fire is lit. If that becomes true, because any log that gets lit is going to set that to true, then the whole thing is going to light. So this is actually sending that to the inventory global variable to say, yes, this log has been lit. Go ahead and turn the signal fire on. And game object torch, game object find torch is just looking for the torch itself. And when it finds it, it's destroying it. So when I throw a torch, I name each one torch. So I only ever have one that I've thrown. So it's going to look for that in this light log script, and then it's going to destroy it after 3 seconds. So that torch doesn't really need to be sitting there. Just get rid of it. Now this code in update is always looking towards that signal fire lit global variable that is in the inventory torch. And when that becomes true, then it's going to light every log that has it. So this script is on every log, and every log is always looking towards this global variable here. And if that global variable ever becomes true, that's what this if line is saying. If signal fire is lit is true, and this particular log that this script is on is not lit, then it lights this log. So let's say I throw the torch and a different log gets hit. That different log is going to change signal fire lit on the inventory torch script to true. And this log, its update is always looking every game loop whether that's going to become true. And if that happens, then it runs the same things that are down here to light the log. It's playing the particle system, playing the sound, setting log lit to true again, and running a debug line. So that's how, and the reason it's setting log lit to true again here is so this won't run more than once for this particular log. Otherwise, it might, try to keep lighting it over and over again, and that will actually create a really the sound will just keep trying to start. It just won't work right. So you only want this to happen once. So for this particular log, it's going to happen on every log, but for each log you only want it to happen once. Okay, so that is getting us to where the win sequence is going to start. If I go back to inventory towards script, so we can look in here to find that global variable, the one that is looking for the signal fire to be lit is this public static boolean signal fire lit global variable, and that's the one that you want to set to true once it becomes lit, and then all of the logs will light. And then you want the win sequence to happen. In addition to the signal fire lit global variable being in inventory torch, this is also where the win sequence is going to be initiated. So if you look lower down in this script, inside of update of the inventory torch script, there is an if statement that says signal fire lit and not game over. So if the signal fire becomes lit, if that becomes true, and the game has not already been over yet, then go ahead and run winObject.sendMessage game over. So it's calling a object that's called winObject. It's sending a message to it, game over, and then game over is being set to true so that this won't run more than once. Okay, so and that means that if game over is a variable in here, it's also a variable up here. I have something for the win object to be brought in here, and I have something for a variable, Boolean variable for game over that is being set to false in start. So those have to be there, of course, before you can run this win sequence. So let's take a look at the win object. The win object is just an empty that we have inside of our endgame stuff, and it's at the center of the world, or it doesn't really matter where you place this particular object. It's sitting by my outpost, but what it has on it is it's got an audio source on it. It's just a plain empty that has an audio source with a win clip plugged in. So the sound that you're going to hear when you win. And it's got a win game update script. So the win game update script has several arguments going into it. You can see there's a plane launcher, which is a transform. There's a plane cam prefab, which is aircraft wings propeller. This is just an object that came with the standard assets. It's a plane, and I took one piece of that standard assets object. It's a prefab in your standard assets, and I brought it into my scene to make it above my sort of entire scene, so that it's looking, so that you could be looking down from that plane to see the signal fire get lit. And then the screen that you want to load to go back to the opening start screen, and then a Win GUI object, which is just going to be a raw image, just like we've created many times, a 1920 by 1080 raw image that I created in Photoshop that just says the plane has seen your signal fire, you are saved. And it's got mostly transparency around there, but I also ran some filter, render, clouds filter on it to create, and it made them transparent. So it looks like you're up in the clouds, and it's projecting some shadows of the text onto the clouds. So that is a 1920 by 1080 image, so it will fill up your screen, and I'm bringing that in as well to the WinGame update script. If I look at the script itself, that is got a UI line and a scene management line at the top, because we do need to load in the start screen again, and we do have some GUI elements for that raw image that I'm showing when you win the game. Here's all your variables that I just showed as inputs into the script. You've got a transform, which is for the plane launcher. Now what the plane launcher is, this is an empty where the plane prefab from standard assets that I'm using will be spawned above my signal fire. I also have a prefab, a camera prefab that I'm going to use to create the animation effect of flying up in the air to where that is. And then I've got a level to load and a raw image to bring in the Win image. So let's go back in and we'll run that end sequence again so you can see that. So let me just grab these. And I'm going to go ahead and light the fire. And so when I light this fire, I'm going to throw the torch, and it's going to start the fire on one of the logs, and then all of the logs are going to catch fire. And then after that happens, it's going to switch to a camera view that flies up in the air to where the plane is. And then we see the Win screen. So let's just go ahead and try that. I throw that. We see the firelight. And now we're flying up in the air to where the plane is to see the help and to get the Win screen. And so that end sequence is very similar to my death sequence, in that I'm spawning a camera that is animated to fly straight upwards. So I just animated it here in Unity. I created a camera just like I did for the deadhead, only I didn't put a rigid body or anything on the camera. Instead, I animated the camera to fly straight up, looking downwards to the place where the plane is. And so that camera is a prefab and it's, if I open up the aircraft wing, you'll see it's part of this entire prefab. So this aircraft wing, and I'm only using the wing because I only see the wing from the camera's point of view. So I only grab that part of the model of the standard assets prefab for this plane. And I placed it up here and I animated it to move forward. So it's got a plane animation on it. And again, I'm just using the legacy animation for these. The animation is just moving it forward at a very slow rate in positive Z. And I've also got some animation on the propeller to rotate it. And there's a sound of the plane as well plugged into it. So that's on the plane itself. And then here's the propeller that's going, that's rotating as well. And again, I'm actually using a script for it to rotate that propeller rather than an animation, just like we did to rotate our power cells and everything else. It's just a transform command. But then here's the plane cam. And the plane cam starts down by the ground. So if I look at it, this plane cam actually starts at the ground. It has an animation on it. And the animation, if I look at it, it's only 2 frames where it starts and where it ends. And if I hit play on it, you'll see it actually move up from the ground. And so it has a ease in and ease out on it as well. And it just goes from where the signal fire logs are straight up to right beside the wing of the plane. And it's child to the plane, so the plane is actually moving very slowly forward in Z over the signal fire. So when the camera goes up, it's actually moving with the plane. So once it reaches its destination, it continues to move with the plane. And if I look at the animation for that, you'll see that it's a very simple animation for that as well. It's just the plane moving forward at a fairly slow rate. And that's giving you the view of the flying up in the sky very quickly and then sort of moving with the plane over the signal fire. I just framed it so that you could see the help on the ground there. So this entire thing is being saved in a prefab so that and all of these animations are set to play on awake. They're set to play automatically. So I don't have to actually trigger the animation to start in my script. It's going to start as soon as this prefab is instantiated. So if I go back to the script, that's what this script is doing. It's instantiating that. It's bringing in all of those things. The launcher for instantiating the prefab down close to the signal fire, and then or above the signal fire, and then bringing in the actual thing that you want to instantiate, which is the plane prefab. And it's doing it with an I enumerator. So the Win GUI is always there. It's just hidden. It's set to false, .enabled false. And then this I enumerator, it's a coroutine, which means it has a yield line in it. And for the same, it's actually got 2 yield lines. So at the beginning here, it prints out a debug line that says game over win sequence started. And then it yields for 3 seconds. And the reason I did that was because I wanted the player to be able to stand there and watch the logs catch fire for 3 seconds before it switched to the other camera and you flew up in the air to start the win sequence. So I want, otherwise you just, as soon as you threw the torch, it would happen, and you wouldn't really see the logs catching fire. So I put a little delay there, and then I have the audio come on, which is the win sound, like da 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 da, you win, and then it's getting the audio here, and then it's playing it, and then here's where it actually instantiates the plane cam prefab, which does the entire win sequence of flying up in the air and then looking down from the plane's point of view. At that point, it shows you the GUI, which is the windscreen that I created in Photoshop. And it waits 10 seconds so you can read that and watch sort of the plane fly over the signal fire and read that it says help. And then it goes and restarts the game and sets all of the global variables back to their original settings and unlocks the cursor so that it will be unlocked when you go into the next screen, and make it visible and load the start screen. At that point, you could either play the game again or you could quit. And then we have a debug line saying welcome to the island of Dr. Moreau, which is again just starting the game over again. So that's all of the stuff that's inside of this game. You could do a win sequence that is any way you want, as long as you make it into a prefab and then you instantiate it. Whatever's in there, whatever animation, whatever stuff that you want to come up, will be instantiated with that prefab. And I'm just doing some animation on a camera and a 3D object of the plane. So you could do whatever you want, and then you have to reset everything and go back to the start screen. So that's all of the scripts in this scene. And go ahead and try to create a win sequence that will be appropriate for your game, and make sure that it takes you back to your start screen, and make sure you design your start screen to be well designed and have an interesting view and give you some backstory or instructions about the game.